Greg Mann knows firsthand how hard it is to be a temporary worker in Chicago. The 55-year-old says in 2015 he was working for a temporary staffing agency and was sent to work in a food packaging factory where he didn't receive proper training.
I wasn't given any instructions on what to do. I was just motioned by body language and hand gestures to start working.
Mann claims he worked in dangerously hot conditions and was reprimanded when he couldn't keep up with the workload.
The fumes were so overwhelming, it's like I couldn't breathe. And so I actually got lightheaded, and I told the supervisor that I couldn't breathe.
Mann says after complaining about the working conditions, the temp agency labeled him as a DNR, or do not return, a code often used to identify workers they no longer want to hire. That experience led Mann to volunteer and eventually work for the Chicago Workers Collaborative, a nonprofit fighting for the rights of low-wage workers. Last year, Mann helped open their new center in Englewood on Chicago's South Side. Mann says since the center opened, cases of discrimination against African-American workers have become far too common, and he says agencies prefer to hire Latino workers.
The overwhelming story that I hear from African Americans are the same thing, that they don't get the jobs. The few that are selected to work at these temp agencies or through these host companies that hire these temp agencies are inferior jobs, which are the conditioned jobs that no one else wants to work.
Regardless of who gets the jobs, Mann says some workers are also victims of wage theft.
They've been forced to take a pay card. The money sometimes is not on the card.
Freddy Amador has a similar story. He's worked for temp agencies in Waukegan for more than a decade.
At
times there was wage theft. They would also force me to work overtime, even if I didn't want to. If I said no, they threatened to fire me. I had to work the hours they wanted me to, otherwise I would lose my job and wouldn't be able to put food on the table or have a place to live.
Amador believes Latino workers are preferred over African American workers because they are often afraid to speak up about unfair treatment.
Temp agencies prefer to hire Latino workers because they know some are undocumented. Therefore, they are more vulnerable, exploitable, and afraid to complain.
Complaints like these are the reason Illinois House Representative Carol Ammon from Champaign-Urbana has introduced a new workers' rights bill targeting staffing agencies that supply temporary workers to companies, mostly in manufacturing. Ammon says temp agencies employ about 840,000 workers in Illinois, and there is a long list of complaints.
Some of those concerns have ranges from injuries on the job or even sexual harassment in some cases, where the employee feels less safe in reporting some of the violations for fear of losing a job.
The bill, also known as HB 690, includes provisions like staffing firms must give 48 hours notice of schedule changes, no charging employees for the cost of drug testing, transportation to and from job sites must be provided, equal pay and benefits for the same work as direct hires, and proper training.
The temp industry has a good role to play in training people for entry-level work, in helping an employer try out an employee before they offer actual permanent employment, but that's not exactly how it's functioning anymore.
Chicago attorney Chris Williams of the Workers' Law Office is currently representing more than a dozen cases against several staffing agencies in Illinois. He says in addition to shortening hours so workers get less money, staffing agencies use code words for labor.
In my cases personally, there's the feos and guapos. Feos in Spanish means the ugly or dirty, guapos means handsome or pretty. And so guapos is used, surprisingly to me when I learned of it, guapos is used to refer to African Americans, kind of the pretty boys. They don't want to get their hands dirty.
Williams applauds the new bill, which would also address discrimination by requiring temp agencies to provide more information about the workers they hire.
The staffing agencies are not keeping records of who they send, what the race or gender of the people they send for particular jobs. And the companies are saying, well, we just take whoever the staffing agency sends.
The high demand for temporary workers boomed after the 2008 recession. Statistics from the American Staffing Association show nationally 3 million people are employed by temp service firms each month, an increase of almost 30% from 2010. Illinois averages more than 174,000 temporary workers each week. More than a third do light industrial work, common in suburban Chicago factories. Dan Showman, a lobbyist for Staffing Services of Illinois, released this statement. Quote, members of the association are very strongly committed to diversity and following the federal, state, and local laws that ban discrimination in hiring and job assignments, and also the many laws and regulations that prevent retaliation against whistleblowers.
Regulation is not a bad word. You know, if we don't regulate certain things, communities would look differently today, and opportunities for people in those communities would also look different today.
Meanwhile, Mann hopes if Latino and African American temp workers unite, they can have an even bigger voice to improve conditions.
We're fighting for the same thing, a chance to work, to provide for our family, to give good education to our children. So we're not enemies to each other. We're both suffering the abuse of these temp agencies and these companies.